Greta Kohler arrived in Clay County, Dakota Territory, in late September 1877, carrying 2 canvas bags, $43, and no husband. She was 26 years old. She was not a widow. She had no father waiting for her, no brother staking land nearby, no fiancé promising to follow in the spring. She came alone because she chose to. The men at the land office asked her 3 times if she understood what she was filing for. The women on the street stopped talking when she walked past. 9 months would teach her that freedom had a price no one warns you about, and that surviving winter alone was easier than surviving the silence that came with it. She thought the hardest part would be the work. She was wrong. Before we go any further, tell me something. Where are you watching this from? City and country? I read every comment. She had left Milwaukee in early September. The city had become unbearable in a quiet way, not through violence or tragedy, but through the slow realization that every door ahead of her required a man to open it. Her father had died 2 winters prior. Her mother followed him 6 months later. There were no siblings, no inheritance worth mentioning, just a rented room above a tailor's shop and a position as a seamstress that paid 60 cents a day when there was work, which there often wasn't. The women she sewed alongside spoke constantly of husbands, the ones they had, the ones they wanted, the ones they'd settle for. Greta listened and said nothing. She had received 3 proposals in the year after her mother's death, all from men older than her father had been, men who saw a woman alone and assumed desperation. She turned them all down. The 3rd man told her she'd regret it, that a woman without protection was asking for ruin. She didn't argue with him. She simply started saving. The idea came from a newspaper article she read in a boarding house parlor. The Homestead Act. 160 acres of land free to anyone willing to file a claim and prove it up over 5 years. The article mentioned men, of course, it always did. But the law itself said nothing about gender, just citizenship, age, and intent. Greta was a citizen. She was over 21, and her intent was absolute. She spent 4 months working double shifts, sleeping less, eating even less. By late August, she had $43, enough for the train, the filing fee, basic tools, and seed for spring. It wasn't much, but it was hers. The journey west was 3 days of dust, noise, and the strange sensation of moving toward something instead of away. The train car smelled of coal smoke, unwashed bodies, and leather. Greta sat near a window, her bags tucked beneath the seat, her hands folded in her lap. Across from her, a family of 5, Swedish or Norwegian, she couldn't tell, spoke in low tones, the mother nursing an infant while 2 small children slept against their father's shoulder. The father caught Greta's eye once and nodded. She nodded back. He didn't ask where her husband was. Perhaps he assumed the man was in another car, or perhaps he simply didn't care. Either way, she was grateful. The landscape changed slowly. The dense green of Wisconsin gave way to the open roll of Minnesota, and then, as they crossed into Dakota Territory, the world flattened into something vast and silent. Grass stretched in every direction, pale gold under a sky so wide it felt like drowning. There were no trees, no hills, just grass and wind and the occasional dark line of a creek cutting through the plain. Greta pressed her hand against the window glass. It was warm from the sun. Outside, the wind bent the grass in long waves like water. She had expected to feel afraid. Instead, she felt something closer to relief. The train stopped in Vermilion on a Thursday afternoon. The platform was nothing more than a stretch of wooden planks and a small station house with peeling paint. Greta stepped down with her bags, and the wind hit her immediately. Dry, constant, carrying the smell of dust and grass and something faintly sweet she couldn't name. The other passengers scattered quickly, met by wagons or family, or simply walking off into the town. Greta stood alone on the platform for a long moment, feeling the weight of the sky above her. Then she picked up her bags and walked toward the main street. Vermilion was smaller than she'd imagined. A single wide dirt road lined with wooden buildings. A general store, a land office, a church with a crooked steeple, a saloon, a boarding house. The buildings looked temporary, like they'd been thrown up quickly and might blow away just as fast. Men stood in clusters outside the saloon, talking in low voices, hats pulled low against the sun. A few glanced at her as she passed. None spoke. Greta kept her eyes forward and walked toward the land office. The man behind the desk was in his 50s, balding, with ink stains on his fingers and a look of permanent exhaustion. He glanced up when she entered, then back down at his paperwork, assuming she was there for her husband. Greta set her bags down and stepped to the counter. "I'd like to file a claim," she said. The man looked up again. He blinked. "Where's your husband?" "I don't have one." He stared at her, a long, searching stare, like he was trying to determine if she was joking or insane. Then he set down his pen. "Miss," he said slowly, "you understand what you're asking for?" "I do." 160 acres, 5 years to prove up. You build a dwelling, you break the sod, you plant crops. You live on it alone. Yes. He leaned back in his chair. It creaked under his weight. "You got family coming out to help?" "No." "A father? Brother?" "No." He exhaled through his nose. "Miss, I don't think you understand what—" "I have $43, Greta said, her voice calm and clear. "I can pay the filing fee. I can sign my name. I meet every legal requirement. So unless the law has changed, I'd like to file my claim." The man stared at her for a long moment. Then he pulled out a ledger and a blank form. He asked her name, her age, her place of birth. He asked if she'd ever been married. She said no. He asked if she understood the terms. She said yes. He slid the paper across the desk. She signed it. He took her $14 for the filing fee and handed her a receipt and a crude map showing her parcel. Section 12, Township 93, 2 miles west of town. He told her the land was flat, no trees, a small creek on the eastern edge. He told her winter came early and stayed late. He told her she'd be alone out there. She thanked him and left. Outside, the sun was lower now, the light turning gold across the storefronts. Greta stood on the wooden sidewalk and looked west, toward the land that was now legally hers. She couldn't see it from here, just more grass, more sky, more wind. She felt the weight of what she'd just done settle into her chest. Not regret, not fear, but something heavier and quieter. Responsibility. She had no one to blame now, no one to ask, no one to fall back on. She picked up her bags and walked toward the general store. The store was dim and smelled of flour, coffee, and kerosene. Shelves lined the walls, stocked with tools, fabric, canned goods, seed. A woman stood behind the counter, middle-aged, sharp-eyed, wearing a plain gray dress and an expression that suggested she'd seen everything and been unimpressed by most of it. She watched Greta approach without smiling. Greta set her list on the counter. "Seed wheat," she said. "Potatoes for planting. A spade, an axe, nails, tar paper, a lantern, kerosene, matches, flour, salt, lard, coffee." The woman glanced at the list, then at Greta. "You got a wagon?" "Not yet." The woman nodded slowly. "You the one who just filed alone?" Word traveled fast. "Yes." The woman didn't say anything for a moment. Then she turned and started gathering items from the shelves. She worked in silence, efficient, her hands moving quickly. When she'd assembled everything, she tallied the cost. $22, she said. Greta counted out the money and handed it over. The woman took it without comment. Then she reached beneath the counter and pulled out a small burlap sack. She set it on top of Greta's pile. "Dried beans," she said. "No charge." Greta looked at her. "Thank you." The woman's expression didn't change. "You'll need more than beans," she said. "But it's a start." Greta loaded everything into a canvas sack and a wooden crate the woman let her borrow. She asked where she could rent a wagon. The woman pointed her toward the livery. Greta thanked her again and left. By the time she'd arranged a wagon and a single horse for $2 a day, the sun was setting. The sky had turned deep orange, streaked with purple, the kind of color that didn't exist back east. Greta loaded her supplies into the wagon, climbed onto the seat, and took the reins. The horse was old and indifferent. She clicked her tongue, and it started walking. The road west was little more than 2 wheel ruts through the grass. The wagon creaked and jolted over uneven ground. The wind picked up as the light faded, carrying the smell of earth and dried grass. Greta kept her eyes on the horizon. She had no house waiting for her, no shelter, just a parcel of land and a receipt in her pocket. The first stars were beginning to appear when she reached the creek marked on her map. She stopped the wagon, climbed down, and stood in the middle of her claim. The grass came up to her waist. The wind moved through it in long, whispering waves. There were no trees, no rocks, no landmarks of any kind, just grass and sky and the thin silver line of the creek in the distance. Greta set down her bags and looked around. This was hers, 160 acres of empty land that no one else had wanted. She thought of Milwaukee, the rented room, the proposals, the slow suffocation of every option requiring someone else's permission. She thought of the man at the land office, the doubt in his eyes, the women on the street who'd stopped talking when she passed. She knelt down and pressed her hand into the soil. It was cool and dry, dense with roots, hard. She would have to break it, turn it, make it yield. She had no idea how, but she would learn. She had to. Greta stood and walked back to the wagon. She pulled out the tar paper, the nails, the axe. She had no lumber, no frame, no foundation, but she had enough materials to build a lean-to against the wagon for the night. She worked in the fading light, her hands clumsy with the hammer, the wind pulling at the paper. By the time full dark settled, she had a crude shelter, just enough to block the wind. She crawled inside, wrapped herself in the blanket she'd brought, and lay on the ground. Above her, the stars were brighter than she'd ever seen, thousands of them, scattered across the black sky like salt spilled on a table. The wind never stopped. It moved through the grass with a sound like breathing. Greta closed her eyes. She had done it. She was here. And she was alone. The first full day on her claim, Greta woke to a sky the color of iron. The wind had died sometime in the night, and the silence was so complete it felt like pressure against her ears. She crawled out from beneath the tar paper shelter, her body stiff from sleeping on hard ground, and stood in the pale pre-dawn light. The grass stretched in every direction, colorless and still. No birds, no movement, just her and the land and the cold air that tasted faintly of dust. She had no coffee. She'd forgotten to bring a pot to boil water, so she ate a handful of dried beans from the sack the woman at the store had given her, chewing slowly, and drank from her canteen. The water was warm and tasted of metal. She swallowed it anyway. Then she walked the boundaries of her claim, pacing it out, trying to make the abstract idea of 160 acres into something real. It took her nearly 2 hours. By the time she returned to the wagon, the sun had risen, flat and white, and the wind had started again. She spent the rest of that day unloading supplies and organizing them under the lean-to. She had no plan yet, no clear sense of what to do first. The land office clerk had mentioned breaking sod, but she didn't know what that meant in practice. She had an axe, a spade, her hands. It would have to be enough. By mid-afternoon, she'd managed to dig a shallow trench near the creek for water drainage, her shoulders burning, blisters already forming on her palms. The work was slow and clumsy. She kept stopping to catch her breath, to wipe the sweat from her face, to look around and remind herself why she was doing this. The answer never changed, because there was nowhere else to go. On the third day, a man arrived. She saw him from a distance first, a dark shape on horseback moving across the grass. Her stomach tightened. She stood and wiped her hands on her skirt, watching him approach. He was older, maybe 50, with a weathered face and a hat pulled low. He rode slowly like he had all the time in the world. When he reached her, he stopped the horse and looked down at her without dismounting. "You the woman filed alone," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." He nodded slowly, his eyes moving over her shelter, her supplies, the shallow trench she'd been digging. "Name's Harlan, got a quarter section about a mile north, Greta." He didn't offer his hand, just sat there, studying her like she was a puzzle he was trying to solve. "Know what you're doing out here?" "I'm learning." He made a sound that might have been a laugh. "Ground's hard this time of year. You'll need a plow to break it proper. Can't do it with a spade." "I don't have a plow," I figured. He shifted in the saddle. "I got one. Could lend it to you. For a day or two." Greta looked at him. His face was unreadable. "What would you want in return?" He smiled then, just a little. "Nothing you ain't willing to give." The words hung in the air between them. Greta felt her jaw tighten. "Thank you," she said carefully, "but I'll manage." Harlan's smile didn't fade. "Suit yourself, but winter comes quick out here. You'll want help before it does." He turned his horse and rode off without another word. Greta watched him go, her heart beating hard in her chest. She stood there long after he disappeared over the low rise to the north, the wind pulling at her hair, her hands still trembling slightly. She understood now. This was how it would be. Men would come. They would offer help. And beneath every offer would be the same assumption that a woman alone was a woman available. She went back to digging. By the end of the first week, 3 more men had stopped by. One brought firewood, unasked for, and left it in a pile near her shelter. He didn't say what he wanted in return, but his eyes did. Another offered to help her build a proper cabin, said he had lumber to spare, said she'd freeze come November without real walls. The third didn't offer anything. He just rode past slowly, twice in one day, watching her work. She didn't acknowledge any of them. She kept her head down, her hands busy, her face blank. But every visit left her more tense, more aware of how visible she was, how exposed. The women were worse in a different way. On Sunday, she walked into town to buy more supplies. The general store was busier than before. Families restocking after church, children running between the aisles, women clustered near the fabric display. When Greta walked in, the conversation didn't stop exactly. It just shifted. Voices dropped. Eyes followed her. She kept her face neutral and walked to the counter. The same woman from before was there, her expression unreadable as always. Greta handed over her list. The woman filled it without comment. But as Greta was counting out her money, one of the other women, younger, blonde, wearing a blue dress with lace at the collar, stepped closer. "You're the one living alone out on Section 12, she said. Her voice was light, almost friendly, but there was something sharp underneath. "Yes," the woman smiled. "That must be hard. All that work. No one to help." "I'm managing. Still." The woman tilted her head slightly like she was considering something. "It's unusual. A woman filing alone." "People talk, you know." Greta looked at her. "Let them." The woman's smile thinned. "I'm just saying it gives the wrong impression. Men get ideas." "Then the men are the problem," Greta said quietly. The woman's face flushed. She opened her mouth, then closed it again. The other women were watching now, silent, waiting. Greta took her change from the counter, picked up her supplies, and walked out. She could feel their eyes on her back the entire way. That night, lying beneath her tar paper shelter with the wind rattling the edges, Greta thought about what the woman had said. People talk. She knew that already. But hearing it out loud made it real in a way it hadn't been before. She wasn't just different. She was a problem, a disruption. The men saw her as opportunity. The women saw her as threat. And neither group was interested in leaving her alone. The work became her refuge. She didn't know how to build a cabin, so she started small, digging a foundation trench, hauling stones from the creek to line it, cutting sod bricks with her spade. The sod was heavier than she'd expected, dense with roots and earth, and cutting it made her hands bleed. But she kept going. She worked from first light until dark, stopping only to eat and drink, her body moving through exhaustion into something like numbness. At night, she was too tired to think. That was the point. By mid-October, she had the foundation laid, and the first 3 rows of sod bricks stacked. It didn't look like much, just a low rectangle of earth. barely knee-high. But it was hers. She had built it with her own hands, brick by brick, and no one could take that from her. And then the widow arrived. Greta was carrying water from the creek when she saw the wagon. It came from the east, moving slowly, pulled by a single tired-looking mule. A woman sat on the seat, older than Greta, maybe 40, wearing black. Widow's weeds. She stopped the wagon near Greta's half-built cabin and climbed down stiffly, like her joints hurt. "You Greta Kohler?" she asked. "Yes." The woman looked her over, her expression unreadable. "Name's Mrs. Calhoun. I live about 3 miles south, heard about you." Greta set down the water pail. "All right." Mrs. Calhoun glanced at the cabin, the tar paper shelter, the scattered supplies. Then she looked back at Greta. "I came to tell you something. You need to be careful." "Careful of what?" "The men around here. They think you're available. I'm not." Mrs. Calhoun's mouth thinned. "Doesn't matter what you are. Matters what they think. And a woman alone." She trailed off, shaking her head. "They'll test you, see how far they can push. Some of them mean well, some don't. But all of them think you need saving. I don't." The widow looked at her for a long moment. Then she reached into her wagon and pulled out a small cloth-wrapped bundle. She handed it to Greta. "Bread," she said, "and some dried venison. You look like you're not eating enough." Greta took it, surprised. "Thank you." Mrs. Calhoun nodded. Then she climbed back onto her wagon. "One more thing," she said, looking down at Greta. "The women in town, they're not going to warm to you. You're everything they're not allowed to be. That scares them, so they'll call you reckless or loose or foolish. Don't let it get under your skin." Greta swallowed. "How do I do that?" The widow smiled faintly, but there was no humor in it. "You endure," she said. "That's all any of us can do." She clicked her tongue, and the mule started walking. Greta stood there with the bundle in her hands, watching the wagon roll away. She unwrapped it that night and found not just bread and venison, but a small jar of honey and a pair of thick wool socks. She sat there in the dark, holding the socks, and felt something crack open in her chest. Not quite tears, but close. She wasn't entirely alone, but she was alone enough. By late October, Greta's hands no longer looked like her own. The blisters had hardened into calluses, thick and yellow, splitting at the edges when she bent her fingers too quickly. Her nails were cracked and rimmed with dirt that wouldn't come out no matter how hard she scrubbed. At night, her shoulders ached so deeply she couldn't lift her arms above her head. Her back throbbed with a dull, constant pain that never quite faded, even when she lay down. She had lost weight. Her skirts hung looser at the waist. Her face, when she caught her reflection in the water pail, looked harder. Older, she was 26, but she could have passed for 35. The cabin was halfway built. 4 walls of sod brick, each about 5 feet high, with gaps left for a door and a single small window. She had no glass for the window yet. No proper door either. Just openings that would have to be covered with hides or canvas until she could afford better. The roof was the next problem. She needed wooden beams to support it, but lumber was expensive and she had no way to haul it from town on her own. She'd spent an entire afternoon trying to figure out if she could make do with thicker sod layers instead, but the structure wouldn't hold. She needed wood. She had $9 left. The wheat seed she'd bought sat in a burlap sack inside the cabin, waiting for spring. She hadn't been able to plant anything yet. The ground was too hard, and she had no plow. Harlan's offer still sat in the back of her mind, sour and unwelcome. She could have broken an acre or 2 by now if she'd accepted. But the cost of that help wasn't one she was willing to pay. So the seed waited, and the ground stayed hard. And Greta kept working on the cabin because it was the only thing she could control. Every day followed the same pattern. She woke before dawn, her body stiff and cold beneath the single wool blanket. She ate a handful of cornmeal mush or cold beans, chewing mechanically, tasting nothing. Then she worked, cutting sod, hauling stones, mixing mud to seal the cracks between bricks, carrying water from the creek, reinforcing the foundation. The work was endless and repetitive, and her mind learned to go blank during it, to exist only in the rhythm of her body moving through space. Lift, carry, set, repeat. She stopped noticing the wind after a while. It was always there, constant and indifferent, pulling at her hair, drying the sweat on her skin before it had time to cool. The sky was always wide and empty. The grass always moved in long, rolling waves. The isolation stopped feeling strange and started feeling normal. She went days without speaking to anyone, weeks without hearing another human voice besides her own. She talked to herself sometimes, just to remember what words sounded like. Small things, observations. You need more water, that wall's crooked. It's colder today. The silence was louder than anything in Milwaukee had ever been. One morning in early November, she woke to frost. It covered the grass in a thin white layer, delicate and temporary, melting as soon as the sun touched it. But the message was clear. Winter was coming. She had maybe 4 weeks, maybe 6 if she was lucky, before the first real snow. The cabin had to be finished by then, or at least close enough to livable that she wouldn't freeze to death inside it. She worked faster after that, longer hours. She stopped taking breaks, stopped eating as much, to stretch her supplies further. Her body became a tool she used without mercy, pushing it past exhaustion, past pain into a kind of mechanical endurance. She didn't think about what she was doing to herself. She couldn't afford to. There was only the work, and the deadline, and the growing cold. By mid-November, the walls were done. She'd managed to trade 2 days of mending work in town for enough lumber to frame a simple roof. The man who sold it to her, a carpenter named Boone, older with kind eyes, had offered to help her install it. She'd thanked him and said no. He'd looked at her for a long moment, then nodded and loaded the lumber onto her wagon without another word. She appreciated that. He hadn't pushed. Raising the roof beams alone was the hardest thing she'd done yet. Each beam was heavy, unwieldy, and had to be lifted into place and secured while she balanced on a wobbly stack of crates. She dropped the first beam twice, nearly hit herself in the head with the second, and spent an hour on the third trying to get the angle right. Her arms shook. Her vision blurred. She kept going. By the time she got all 4 beams in place and nailed down, it was dark and she could barely stand. She climbed down from the crates, sat on the ground, and stared at the cabin. It had a roof. She'd done it. She sat there for a long time, too tired to move, her breath visible in the cold air. Then she crawled inside, wrapped herself in the blanket, and slept for 12 hours straight. The next week, she covered the roof with tar paper and sod, layering it thick to keep out snow and wind. She hung a canvas tarp over the door opening. She stuffed rags and mud into the gaps around the window. She built a small fire pit inside, near the back wall, with stones arranged to contain the flames and a hole in the roof above it for smoke. It wasn't much. The walls were uneven. The floor was dirt and the whole structure smelled like wet earth. But it was shelter. It was walls. It was hers. She moved her supplies inside and stood in the center of the single small room, looking around. The space was maybe 10 feet by 12, barely big enough for a bed, a table, a stove if she ever got one. The light from the window was thin and gray. The air was cold. But it was inside. Protected. She thought of the rented room in Milwaukee, the narrow bed, the thin walls, the landlord who knocked whenever he pleased. She thought of the men who'd proposed, the houses they would have given her, the warmth and security and suffocation. This was better. It had to be. On November 23rd, the first snow fell. She woke to silence, a different kind of silence, muffled and thick. She pushed open the canvas door and looked out. The world was white. Snow covered the grass, the creek, the low hills in the distance. It was still falling soft and steady with no wind to drive it. Beautiful, deadly. Greta stood in the doorway and watched it come down, her breath fogging in the air. She had firewood stacked inside, enough for maybe 2 weeks if she was careful. After that, she'd have to venture out to gather more, assuming she could find any. There were no trees on her claim. She'd been hauling deadfall from the creek bed, but snow would make that harder. She had cornmeal, beans, a little flour, salt, lard, not much else. She'd budgeted poorly. Spent too much on building materials, not enough on food. It was too late to fix that now. The snow fell for 2 days. When it stopped, the world was buried under 8 inches of white. Greta wrapped herself in every layer she owned and went outside to check the cabin. The roof had held. No leaks. The walls were solid. She felt a small, fierce pride in that. Then she trudged through the snow to the creek. The water was still flowing, but slower now, ice forming at the edges. She filled her pail and carried it back, her feet numb inside her boots. That night, she rationed her firewood carefully, burning just enough to keep from freezing. The cold crept in through the walls anyway, settling into her bones, making her joints ache. She wrapped the blanket around herself and sat close to the fire, watching the flames. Outside, the wind had picked up again, rattling the tar paper on the roof. She thought about the winter ahead. 3 months, maybe 4 of this. Cold, isolation, hunger if her supplies ran out. She thought about dying out here alone and no one finding her body until spring. She pushed the thought away. She had survived this long. She would survive longer. But that night, lying in the dark, listening to the wind, she allowed herself one small moment of doubt. She thought about Milwaukee, about warmth, about voices, about not being alone. She thought about the third man who'd proposed to her, the one who'd said she'd regret turning him down. She wondered if he'd been right. Then she thought about what accepting would have meant. The slow erasure of herself, the endless compromises, the life spent small and quiet and approved of. And the doubt faded, replaced by something harder. She would rather freeze out here than suffocate back there. The choice was still the right one, even if it hurt, even if it cost everything. Choices had costs, even when they were the right ones. By early December, the isolation had started to change her in ways she hadn't expected. She talked to herself more often now, full conversations, arguing both sides of decisions she had to make. Should she burn more firewood tonight or save it for tomorrow? Should she try to walk to town for more supplies or wait until the weather cleared? She answered herself out loud, hearing her own voice in the empty cabin like it belonged to someone else. It didn't frighten her. It was just necessary, a way to keep her mind from going too quiet. The work continued, but it was different now. Maintenance instead of building, clearing snow from the door, checking the roof for ice, hauling water, rationing food. The days were shorter, the light thin and gray even at noon. She marked time by the position of the sun when she could see it, by the depth of the cold, by how much firewood she had left. Weeks blurred together. She stopped counting days. She thought often about Mrs. Calhoun, the widow who'd brought her bread and socks. She hadn't seen her since. Wondered if she was all right. Wondered if anyone would check on Greta if she stopped appearing in town. Probably not. She was the strange one, the woman who'd chosen this. If she failed, it would only confirm what everyone already believed, that a woman alone couldn't make it, that she'd been foolish to try. Greta sat by the fire one night, her hands wrapped around a tin cup of weak coffee, and made herself a promise. She would not fail. She would not give them the satisfaction. She would survive this winter and the next and the one after that. She would prove up her claim, every single acre. And when it was done, when the land was legally hers, she would stand on it and know that she'd earned it. Not through marriage, not through inheritance, through her own hands, her own will, her own refusal to be anything other than free. The cost was high, but the alternative had been higher. The second week of December brought cold that felt different, deeper, more permanent. The kind of cold that didn't just touch the skin but seeped into the lungs, into the bones, into the very air inside the cabin. Greta woke one morning and saw her breath hanging thick and white even though she was inside, even though the fire had been burning all night. She crawled out from under the blanket, her joints stiff, and fed more wood into the flames. The pile against the wall was smaller than it had been yesterday, and yesterday it had been smaller than the day before. She had maybe a week of firewood left, 2 if she burned almost nothing. Outside, the sky was the color of old iron. No sun. Just heavy, low clouds pressing down on the prairie like a hand. The wind had a new sound to it, sharper, meaner, whistling through gaps in the sod she hadn't known were there. She pulled on every piece of clothing she owned, wrapped a scarf around her face and pushed through the canvas door. The cold hit her like a wall. It stole her breath, made her eyes water instantly. She forced herself forward, boots crunching through snow that had frozen into a hard crust overnight. She needed to check the creek, needed water, needed to see if the ice had thickened. She trudged toward it, head down against the wind, her hands already numb inside her gloves. The creek was frozen solid. She stood on the bank, staring at the white expanse where running water had been just days ago. She had no axe heavy enough to break through ice this thick. No tools designed for it. She knelt down and tried anyway, chipping at the surface with the edge of her spade. The ice barely cracked. She hit it harder. Again. Her arms burned. Her breath came in gasps. After 10 minutes, she'd made a dent the size of her fist. She sat back on her heels, panting. No water meant no drinking, no cooking, no washing. She had maybe 2 days' worth left in the pail inside the cabin. After that, she didn't finish the thought. She stood up, brushed the snow off her skirt, and walked back. Inside, she rationed what water she had. A single cup in the morning, another at night. She stopped washing, stopped cooking anything that required boiling. Just ate the beans and cornmeal cold, chewing slowly, forcing herself to swallow. The hunger was constant now, a dull ache that never quite went away. She tried not to think about it, tried not to think about how much food she had left, how many weeks until spring, how many ways this could go wrong. On December 15th, the blizzard came. She'd seen storms before, wind and snow and cold that made the world disappear. But this was different. She woke in the middle of the night to a sound like a freight train bearing down on the cabin. The walls shook. The tar paper on the roof rattled and snapped. The wind screamed high and shrill, and the snow came sideways, horizontal, slamming against the sod with a force that felt intentional. Greta sat up, heart pounding, and added wood to the fire with shaking hands. The flames guttered and nearly went out. She cupped her hands around them, breathing carefully, willing them to hold. The storm lasted 3 days. 3 days of wind that never stopped, snow that piled against the door until she couldn't push it open, cold that turned the inside of the cabin into a tomb. She burned through her firewood faster than she'd planned, because the alternative was freezing to death. She ate sparingly, mechanically, her mind focused only on staying warm, staying alive, staying conscious. She didn't sleep much, just dozed in short bursts, waking every time the fire dimmed, feeding it, drifting off again. On the second day, the wind tore a section of tar paper off the roof. Snow blew in through the gap, swirling around the cabin, settling on the floor, on her blanket, on her hands. She tried to climb up and fix it, but the wind was too strong and the roof too slick with ice. She gave up and huddled closer to the fire, wrapping the blanket tight around her shoulders. The snow kept coming in. She stopped noticing after a while. By the third day, she'd run out of firewood. She sat in the center of the cabin, wrapped in the blanket, staring at the dead fire pit. The cold was immediate and absolute. It pressed against her from all sides, squeezing, relentless. She couldn't feel her feet. Her fingers were stiff and clumsy. Her breath came in shallow gasps. She thought about burning her few possessions, the crate, the canvas, anything that would catch. But they wouldn't last long. And then she'd have nothing. She thought about the men who'd offered to help, Harlan with his plow, Boone with his lumber, even the others, the ones whose names she didn't know, who'd stopped by with firewood or offers to build her a proper cabin. She'd said no to all of them, and now she was going to die because of it. No. The thought came sharp and clear, cutting through the fog of cold and exhaustion. No. She had not come this far, sacrificed this much, endured this long, just to freeze in the dark because she was too proud to think. There had to be another way. There was always another way. She forced herself to stand. Her legs shook, her vision blurred. She stumbled to the corner where she kept her tools and pulled out the spade. Then she opened the canvas door. The wind hit her like a fist. Snow blasted into her face, blinding her, stealing her breath. She couldn't see more than a few feet in any direction. Just white, just wind, just cold. She pushed forward anyway, one step at a time, heading toward the creek. If she could reach it, if she could find deadfall buried under the snow, if she could drag it back. She made it maybe 50 feet before she fell. The world tilted. Her knees hit the snow. She tried to stand and fell again. The cold was inside her now, in her chest, in her head, slowing everything down. She lay there for a moment, face pressed against the frozen ground, and felt something close to relief. It would be easier to just stop, to let go, to sleep. Then she thought of them, the men who'd assumed she'd fail, the women who'd called her reckless, the clerk at the land office who'd asked 3 times if she understood what she was filing for. She thought of them hearing the news in spring, found her frozen, told you so, knew she couldn't do it. Greta dragged herself to her knees, then to her feet. She couldn't see the cabin anymore, couldn't see anything, but she turned in the direction she thought it was and started walking. One step, another. The wind pushed her sideways. She corrected, kept moving. Her hands were empty. She'd dropped the spade somewhere, didn't matter. She just needed to get back, just needed to make it inside. She hit the cabin wall with her shoulder, almost didn't recognize it. Felt along it until she found the door. Pushed through, fell onto the dirt floor, kicked the canvas shut behind her. She lay there gasping, her body shaking so hard her teeth chattered. Slowly, painfully, she crawled to the blanket and wrapped it around herself. No fire, no warmth, just the blanket and the walls, and the knowledge that she'd almost died out there, that she'd come within minutes of it. She sat in the dark and waited for the storm to pass. It ended sometime in the night. The wind stopped. The world went silent. Greta didn't move. She sat against the wall, the blanket pulled tight, her body numb, her mind drifting in and out of something that wasn't quite sleep. She thought about Milwaukee, about her mother's funeral, about the rented room and the 3rd proposal and the moment she decided to leave. She thought about the train west and the land office and the first night on her claim under a sky full of stars. She thought about freedom and what it cost. When dawn came, pale and gray, she forced herself to stand. Her legs barely held her. She pushed open the canvas door and looked out. The world was white and still. Snow covered everything, smooth and unmarked. The sky was clear now, pale blue, empty. The sun sat low on the horizon, cold and distant. Greta stepped outside and trudged through knee-deep drifts toward the creek. Her body moved automatically, too tired to feel, too cold to care. The storm had broken branches off the few scraggly trees along the creek bank. She found them half buried in the snow and dragged them back, one at a time, her breath coming in ragged gasps. It took her most of the morning. By the time she had enough wood for a fire, her hands were bleeding and she couldn't stop shaking. But she built the fire, fed it carefully, sat close and let the heat soak into her skin. She stayed there for hours, unmoving, staring into the flames. She had survived. Barely, but she had survived, and the winter wasn't over yet. That night, Greta sat by the fire and took stock. She had maybe 2 weeks of food left if she stretched it. Almost no firewood except what she'd salvaged today. No water except what she could melt from snow. The nearest neighbor was a mile away. The nearest town was 2, and the weather could turn again at any moment. She could leave, walk to town, ask for help, stay at the boarding house until spring. No one would blame her. Most would say it was the sensible thing to do, the smart thing, the thing any reasonable woman would do. But if she left, she'd lose the claim. The law required continuous residence, 5 years of living on the land. If she abandoned it now, even for the winter, someone else could file on it. Or she'd have to start the 5 years over. Either way, everything she'd done would be for nothing. Greta looked around the cabin, at the walls she'd built, the roof she'd raised, the floor she'd smoothed with her own hands. She thought about the men who'd offered help and the women who'd judged her and the clerk who doubted her. She thought about the price of being free, She wasn't leaving. Not for the winter. Not for the cold. Not for the hunger or the fear or the very real possibility that she might not survive. She'd made a choice when she filed that claim, and she was going to see it through. Even if it killed her, sometimes the bravest thing is choosing difficult freedom over comfortable constraint. Sometimes surviving isn't about being strong. It's about refusing to let go. It's about enduring when endurance is the only option left. Greta fed another stick to the fire and wrapped the blanket tighter around her shoulders. Outside, the wind began to rise again. January came with a cold that felt personal. Not the sharp, violent cold of the blizzard, but something slower, heavier. The kind of cold that settled into the cabin and refused to leave, that turned the dirt floor into frozen stone, that made every breath visible even at midday. Greta woke each morning to frost on the inside of the walls, delicate patterns of ice spreading across the sod like lace, beautiful and deadly. She stopped noticing after the first week. Time became strange. Days blurred together, indistinguishable except for the slow shrinking of her supplies. She marked the passage of weeks by counting beans, by how much cornmeal was left in the sack, by the depth of snow outside the door. She stopped going to town. The roads were impassable, and she couldn't risk the walk in weather that could turn without warning. She was alone now in a way she hadn't been before. Truly alone. Cut off. No one coming. No one going. Just her in the cabin and the endless white silence. She talked to herself constantly now. Not just observations, but full conversations, arguments. She debated whether to burn an extra piece of wood or save it for tomorrow, whether to eat a full portion of beans or stretch them another day. She answered herself in different tones, as if there were two people in the cabin instead of one. The rational voice that said save everything, ration carefully, survive at all costs. And the other voice, quieter, more desperate, that said she was so tired, so cold, so hungry. And what did it matter anyway if she was just going to die out here alone? She ignored that second voice, mostly. The hunger was the worst part. Not the sharp, immediate hunger of a missed meal, but the deep, grinding emptiness that never went away. She'd been rationing for weeks now, eating a quarter of what her body needed. And it showed. Her hands looked skeletal, the bones too visible beneath the skin. Her face, when she caught her reflection in the water pail, was gaunt and hollow-eyed. She didn't recognize herself anymore. The woman staring back looked 50 years old, looked beaten, looked like someone who'd already lost. But she kept going. Every morning she forced herself to stand, to move, to keep her blood flowing. She did small tasks to fill the hours, reorganizing her supplies, mending tears in her blanket with thread pulled from the hem of her dress, carving marks into the wall to track the days. Anything to keep her mind occupied, anything to keep from thinking about how much longer winter would last, how much food she had left, how many ways she could die before spring. The isolation did something to her mind. She started seeing things that weren't there, shadows moving at the edge of her vision. Hearing sounds, footsteps outside, voices calling her name, her mother's voice asking why she'd left. She knew they weren't real, but knowing didn't make them stop. Sometimes she answered the voices anyway, just to hear herself speak, just to remember that she still could. One night in mid-January, she woke to the sound of scratching at the door. She sat up, heart pounding, listening. There it was again, deliberate, insistent, something trying to get in. She grabbed the spade, the only weapon she had, and moved toward the canvas door. The scratching stopped. Silence. She waited, barely breathing. Then she heard it, low and rumbling. A growl. Wolf or coyote. She couldn't tell. Didn't matter. Whatever it was outside her door, and there was nothing between them but a piece of canvas. She stood frozen, gripping the spade, her mind racing. If it tore through the canvas, if it got inside, she had no chance. The space was too small. She was too weak. It would be over in seconds. The growling continued, then footsteps circling the cabin. She heard it sniffing at the walls, testing, looking for a way in. She didn't move, didn't breathe, just stood there in the dark, waiting. The fire had burned down to embers. She couldn't see anything, could only hear. After what felt like hours but was probably minutes, the sound stopped. She waited longer, listening. Nothing. Just wind. Just silence. She didn't sleep the rest of that night, just sat with her back against the wall, the spade across her lap, staring at the door. At dawn, she ventured outside. The snow around the cabin was trampled, disturbed. Tracks circled the walls, paw prints, larger than a dog's. They led off toward the creek and disappeared. She stood there, staring at them, and felt something crack inside her chest. Not fear, something worse. The realization that she was prey out here, that the land didn't care about her choices or her reasons, that nature would take her if it got the chance. She went back inside and barricaded the door with the wooden crate. It wouldn't stop a wolf, but it might slow it down. Give her a few seconds. That was all she could do. The days grew longer by imperceptible degrees. The sun rose a few minutes earlier, set a few minutes later. She noticed because she had nothing else to notice. Every small change in the light felt like progress, felt like proof that winter wouldn't last forever. That spring was coming, however slowly. She clung to that thought, repeated it to herself like a prayer. Spring is coming. You just have to last until spring. But lasting was getting harder. By late January, she was down to her final supplies. A handful of cornmeal, a dozen beans, a small piece of lard, rancid but edible, no coffee, no salt, no firewood except what she could scavenge from the creek, which meant venturing out into the cold every other day, risking frostbite, risking falling, risking another blizzard catching her outside. She did it anyway, because the alternative was freezing to death in the cabin. She thought about the women in town, the ones with warm houses and full kitchens and husbands who brought in firewood and game. She thought about the conversations they were probably having right now, sitting by their stoves, safe and fed and surrounded by family. She imagined them talking about her, wondering if she was still alive, assuming she wasn't, shaking their heads and saying they'd known all along it would end this way. The thought made her angry, and the anger helped. It pushed back against the despair, gave her something to hold on to. She would not die out here and prove them right. She would not become a cautionary tale, a story mothers told their daughters about the dangers of wanting too much, of choosing wrong, of thinking you could be something other than what the world decided for you. She would survive, even if it was just to spite them. One afternoon in early February, Greta sat by the fire, staring at her hands. They were shaking, not from cold, though she was cold, from hunger, from exhaustion, from the slow, steady breakdown of her body under conditions it wasn't meant to endure. She thought about Milwaukee again, about the proposals, about the life she could have had, warm, fed, safe. All she would have had to do was say yes. All she would have had to do was accept that her life belonged to someone else. She thought about it seriously for the first time, really thought about it. What if she'd been wrong? What if freedom wasn't worth this much pain? What if the cost was too high? She sat there for a long time, turning the question over in her mind. And then, slowly, she thought about what going back would mean now. Returning to Milwaukee with nothing, admitting defeat, taking a husband, any husband, out of desperation instead of choice, living the rest of her life knowing she'd tried to be free and failed, knowing she hadn't been strong enough. That would be worse than dying out here. At least if she died, she'd die still believing in the choice she'd made, still holding on to the part of herself that refused to be owned. But if she went back, that part would die anyway, slowly, quietly, erased by years of compromise and silent resentment. She would survive in body but not in spirit. And what was the point of surviving if you had to kill the best part of yourself to do it? Greta fed the last piece of wood to the fire and watched the flames catch. She had made her choice, and she was going to live with it, or die with it. Either way, it was hers. The prairie didn't care who you used to be. It only cared what you could endure. The next morning she woke to something different. The light through the window was brighter, warmer. She sat up confused and looked outside. The snow was still there. The cold was still there, but the sun was higher in the sky. And the air, when she breathed, didn't burn quite as much. She stepped outside, barefoot in the snow, and tilted her face toward the sun. It was still winter, still brutal. But the worst of it was over. She could feel it. The days were getting longer. The cold was getting weaker. Spring was coming. She stood there for a long time, letting the pale sunlight touch her face. She had no food left, no firewood, no money, no plan. But she was still standing, still breathing, still alive. And that was enough. It had to be. Some loneliness is clean. The other kind stains you from the inside. Greta had learned the difference this winter, had felt the stain settling into her bones, into her thoughts, into the way she saw the world. But she had also learned something else. That loneliness was bearable. That silence didn't have to mean defeat. That being alone wasn't the same as being broken. She thought about Mrs. Calhoun, the widow who'd told her to endure. She thought about all the women who'd survived winters like this, alone or widowed or abandoned, who'd held on through cold and hunger and fear and come out the other side changed but undefeated. She was one of them now, part of a lineage of women who'd refused to be anything other than themselves, no matter the cost. Greta turned and walked back into the cabin. She wrapped the blanket around her shoulders and sat by the dead fire. Outside, the sun climbed higher. The snow began to melt, just a little, dripping from the roof, softening at the edges. Winter wasn't over, but she had survived the worst of it, and she would survive the rest. The thaw came slowly, reluctantly, like the land itself wasn't sure it wanted to let go of winter. The first signs appeared in early March, patches of bare ground where the snow had melted away, revealing brown grass flattened and dead. The creek started flowing again, sluggish at first, then stronger, carrying chunks of ice downstream. The air warmed by degrees so small Greta barely noticed at first, but she did notice. Every shift in temperature, every new sound, every change in the light felt significant because she'd survived to see it. She walked to town on the first clear day, her body weak and unsteady, her legs threatening to give out with every step. The 2-mile journey took her most of the morning. She had to stop and rest 3 times, sitting on rocks at the side of the road, breathing hard, willing herself to keep going. When she finally reached Vermilion, the main street looked exactly the same as it had in September. The same buildings, the same mud, the same men standing outside the saloon. But she was different now, hollowed out, harder, changed in ways she didn't have words for yet. She went to the general store first. The same woman stood behind the counter, her expression unreadable as always. She looked at Greta for a long moment, at her gaunt face, her hollow eyes, the way her dress hung loose on her frame, and said nothing. Just waited. "I need supplies," Greta said. Her voice sounded strange, hoarse from disuse, on credit. The woman's eyebrows rose slightly. "You got money coming?" "In spring, after I plant, after harvest. That's a long time to wait." "I know." The woman studied her. Then she pulled out a ledger and opened it. "What do you need?" Greta listed it. Seed wheat, cornmeal, flour, salt, lard, coffee, nails. The woman wrote it down without comment. When she was finished, she tallied the cost. $11, she said. Greta nodded. "I'll pay it back. With interest if you want." The woman looked at her again, that long, searching look. Then she closed the ledger. "No interest," she said, "just pay it when you can." Greta felt something tighten in her throat. "Thank you." The woman shrugged. "You made it through winter alone. That's worth something." She helped Greta load the supplies into a borrowed handcart. As Greta was leaving, the woman called after her. "You need help planting? There's men who'd do it for fair wages. Not the ones who came sniffing around before. The decent ones." Greta paused. "I'll keep that in mind. She didn't hire anyone. She couldn't afford wages and she didn't want the debt. So she broke the sod herself. one back-breaking foot at a time, using the spade and her own weight to cut through roots that had been growing undisturbed for decades. The work was brutal. Worse than building the cabin, worse than hauling water or stacking sod bricks. This was fighting the earth itself, trying to force it into submission, and the earth fought back. It took her 3 weeks to break 2 acres. By the time she was done, her hands were raw and bleeding. Her back screamed with pain every time she bent over, and she could barely lift her arms above her shoulders. But the ground was turned. The soil was exposed, and she could plant. She did it in early April, walking the rows she'd made, dropping wheat seeds into the furrows, covering them with dirt. The work was meditative, almost peaceful after the violence of breaking sod. She moved slowly, carefully, her mind empty except for the rhythm of the task. Plant, cover, step, repeat. The sun was warm on her back. The wind was softer now, carrying the smell of wet earth and new growth. She could hear birds again. The first she'd heard since October. Their song sounded impossibly loud after months of silence. When she finished planting, she stood at the edge of her field and looked at what she'd done. 2 acres of freshly turned earth, dark and rich, stretching out in uneven rows. It wasn't much compared to the larger homesteads around her, but it was hers, every inch of it earned. And if the rain came, if the wheat grew, if she managed to bring in even a small harvest, she'd have something to sell, something to pay back her debt and buy supplies for next winter. If. The word hung in her mind, heavy and unavoidable. So much depended on factors she couldn't control. Weather, insects, disease. She'd done everything she could. Now all she could do was wait. April turned into May. The wheat sprouted, thin green shoots pushing up through the soil, fragile and tentative. Greta checked them every morning, kneeling in the dirt, running her fingers over the delicate blades. They were growing. Slowly, but they were growing. She felt something she hadn't felt in months. Not quite hope, but close. The neighbors started appearing again. Not the men who'd come in fall with their thinly veiled offers. Different ones, families mostly. A couple from 3 miles south stopped by with a basket of eggs and an invitation to Sunday supper. Greta thanked them and declined. A Swedish family to the north brought her a jar of preserved vegetables and asked if she needed help with her fence line. She said no, but thanked them. They didn't push, just nodded and left. The women in town were different now, too. Not friendly exactly, but not hostile either. They acknowledged her when she passed on the street. A few even nodded. The woman in the blue dress who'd confronted her back in October stopped her outside the general store one afternoon. "I was wrong about you," she said. Her voice was stiff, formal. "I didn't think you'd last the winter." Greta looked at her. "Neither did I," she said. The woman blinked, surprised. Then something shifted in her face. Not quite a smile, but close. "Well," she said, "you did." She walked away before Greta could respond, but the exchange stayed with her. It wasn't acceptance, it wasn't friendship, but it was acknowledgement. Recognition. She had proven something. Not to them, maybe, but to herself. In late May, Mrs. Calhoun came by again. She looked older than Greta remembered, more tired, but her eyes were still sharp. She climbed down from her wagon and walked to where Greta was weeding the wheat rows. "You're still here," she said. "Yes." Mrs. Calhoun nodded slowly, looking out over the field. "I wasn't sure you would be. Neither was I." The widow reached into her wagon and pulled out a bundle wrapped in cloth. "Bread," she said, "and some bacon. You're too thin." Greta took it, her throat tight. "Thank you." Mrs. Calhoun looked at her for a long moment. "You know what the hardest part is?" she asked. "What?" "It's not the work. It's not the cold or the hunger or the fear. It's knowing that no matter how much you prove, there will always be people who think you shouldn't have tried." Greta nodded. "I know." The widow smiled faintly. "Good," she said. "Then you're learning." She climbed back onto her wagon and rode off. Greta stood there, holding the bundle, watching her go. Then she went inside and ate half the bread and saved the rest for tomorrow. It was the best thing she'd tasted in months. June brought rain. Not a lot, but enough. The wheat grew taller, the stalks thickening, the grain beginning to form. Greta walked through the field every evening, checking for pests, for disease, for any sign of trouble. She found aphids on a few plants and picked them off by hand. Found a section where the soil was too dry and hauled water from the creek to soak it. The work never stopped, but it was different now. Purposeful, productive. She was building something instead of just surviving. By early July, the wheat was waist-high and turning gold. Greta stood at the edge of her field one evening, the sun low on the horizon, and allowed herself to believe it might actually work. She might actually bring in a harvest, might actually make it, but she didn't allow herself to celebrate. Not yet. Too much could still go wrong. Hail, fire, locusts. She'd heard stories of entire crops destroyed in a single afternoon by swarms that descended without warning and ate everything down to the roots. She wouldn't feel safe until the wheat was cut, threshed, and sold. Harvest came in late July. She had no harvesting equipment, so she did it by hand, using a scythe she'd borrowed from the Swedish family. She worked from dawn until dark, cutting the wheat in long, sweeping strokes, bundling it, stacking it to dry. Her hands blistered again. Her back ached, but she kept going. By the end of the first week, she'd cut half the field. By the end of the second, it was done. Threshing took another week, beating the grain free from the stalks, winnowing it, bagging it. The yield was smaller than she'd hoped, but it was something. 300 pounds of wheat. Enough to sell. Enough to pay her debt. Enough to prove she could do this. She hauled it to town on a borrowed wagon and sold it to the grain buyer for $22. She paid the woman at the general store the $11 she owed, bought supplies for winter, and walked out with $3 left. It wasn't much, but it was hers. That night back in her cabin, Greta sat by the fire and stared at the $3 silver in her palm. She thought about the winter, about the cold and the hunger and the nights she'd been sure she wouldn't survive. She thought about the men who'd assumed she'd fail and the women who'd treated her like a threat. She thought about the choices she'd made and the prices she'd paid. She was still here, still standing, still free. It hadn't been easy. It hadn't been clean. And the peace she'd imagined, the quiet satisfaction of proving everyone wrong, hadn't come. She was still lonely, still judged, still on the outside looking in. But she'd survived. And more than that, she'd proven to herself that she could. The land was hers now in a way it hadn't been before. Not legally, not yet. She still had 4 years left to prove up. But in her bones, in her hands, in the blood she'd shed and the nights she'd endured, and the wheat she'd grown from soil she'd broken herself. Greta closed her fist around the coins and set them on the table. Then she lay down on the narrow bed she'd built, just a wooden frame and a straw mattress, and closed her eyes. Outside, the wind moved through the grass. The creek flowed steady and low. The sky was clear and full of stars. She had not won. Not in the way stories promised. There was no triumphant ending, no acceptance from the community, no love or recognition or reward beyond the knowledge that she'd survived. But she had not lost either. She had chosen difficult freedom over comfortable constraint, and she had endured long enough to see the choice through. That was enough. It had to be. Spring had been dirty and hard, and far from the new beginning she'd imagined. But it had been hers. And so was the summer. And so would be the years ahead, however many she managed to claim. Greta Kohler fell asleep that night with dirt under her nails and calluses on her palms, and the knowledge that she had become exactly what she'd set out to be. Free. Not saved, not celebrated, not understood, but free. And in the Dakota Territory in 1878, for a woman alone, that was revolution enough. Sometimes freedom is just another kind of burden, but it's a burden you choose to carry. And that choice, that one small, stubborn choice to remain yourself, even when it costs everything, that's what survives long after the cold, and the hunger, and the loneliness fade. Greta planted again the next spring, and the spring after that. She never married, never softened, never apologized for the choice she made. By 1882, she'd proven up her claim. 160 acres, legally hers. She built a larger cabin, bought a horse, hired seasonal help during harvest. She was never wealthy, never comfortable, but she was never owned either. The town learned to leave her alone. The women stopped seeing her as a threat and started seeing her as something stranger. Proof that the rules weren't as fixed as they'd believed. Some resented her for it. Others quietly envied her. Most simply forgot about her, which suited her fine. Mrs. Calhoun died in the winter of 1883. Greta went to the funeral and stood in the back, silent, while the preacher talked about sacrifice and endurance. Afterward, at the graveside, one of the widow's daughters approached her. "She talked about you sometimes," the daughter said. Said you reminded her of herself when she was young. Greta didn't know what to say to that, so she just nodded. The daughter handed her a small wooden box. "She wanted you to have this." Inside was a silver thimble and a folded piece of paper. Greta unfolded it. The handwriting was shaky but clear. "You endured. That's all any of us can do." Greta stood there, holding the note, staring at the words. Then she folded it carefully and put it in her pocket. She carried it with her for the rest of her life. Have you ever chosen something difficult because it was the only way to remain yourself? Have you ever paid a price so high you questioned whether it was worth it, and then kept paying it anyway because the alternative was worse? Share your story in the comments. I want to know what your winter looked like, and whether you made it through.